Good afternoon. My name is Pam Strickland. I'm the founder of North Carolina Stop Human Trafficking, and I am so glad that you have joined me today for an overview of the anti-human trafficking movement in North Carolina. I invite you to introduce yourself in the chat box if you'd like to. Give your name and your organization and where you are. You might see some friends that you already know, or you might find some folks that are close to you that you need to get to know. Make some contacts here. I am going to invite you to use the Q&A icon if you have questions or comments as we go through, and I'll stop every few minutes and check that. And with that, we're going to get started. I'm going to share my screen with you. So first, a little bit about us. Our vision is a state free of human trafficking. And our mission, or the way we go about trying to accomplish our vision, is by creating communities that are actively working to abolish human trafficking. And so when we say communities, we don't necessarily mean a geographic area. It could be a faith community or an education community, the law enforcement community, any group that you are a part of. So I want to share with you how our action steps for how we go about that. The first is education. So we train a lot of professionals, folks like law enforcement, social workers, school professionals, healthcare providers, mental health care providers. We educate them about the signs and how to identify victims of human trafficking. Because unfortunately, they almost never self-identify. They aren't a typical victim as we think of a victim who is reaching out and asking for help. So we have to be able to identify them and offer help. We also, in addition to our training of professionals, we also offer just general awareness training for the public as well. If you are interested in seeing what some of our previous webinars have been, you are welcome to go to our website, or you can go to our YouTube channel and see some webinars there. Of course, collaboration is a huge part of what we do. Human trafficking is such a huge issue that no one agency could possibly hope to tackle it alone. So it's really important to work with others in other disciplines. And so one of the things that we have done in that regard is we've created the Pitt County Coalition Against Human Trafficking here in our area. It's modeled after the North Carolina Coalition Against Human Trafficking that our nonprofit has been a part of since we began. If in your area you don't have a coalition and you're interested in forming one, please feel free to shoot me an email and we'd be glad to work with you on that. Legislation is incredibly important, particularly as we look at providing services to victims and also, of course, consequences to the perpetrators. So we are very interested and engaged in improving our statutes here in North Carolina and also on the federal level. And of course, we're interested in fair trade and fair trade products. Hopefully some of y'all are familiar with that. The most common ones that you might have seen with that fair trade logo on it would be coffee, tea, chocolate, and sugar. So we encourage people to buy products that are not made by exploited people and to increase demand for those fair trade certified products. So what everyone always asks us, they always want to know numbers about human trafficking, and numbers are so hard to get on human trafficking. So I'm going to share some with you, but I'm going to offer a caveat. So the data I'm about to share here on this slide is from the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And so it's completely accurate for what it is, which is it reflects calls made from North Carolina to that hotline. But what it does not include are calls made to local law enforcement, to DSS, to domestic violence shelters or sexual assault agencies. Doesn't include calls made to the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation or the FBI or ICE. So you get the idea. There's a lot of other places that receive calls about human trafficking aside from this hotline. So it's not a truly accurate representation of prevalence in North Carolina. And of course, the sad truth that we all understand is that most cases of human trafficking go unreported to anyone. So the data reflects that in 2021, there were 922 calls from North Carolina to the hotline. Now, not all of those calls were to report a case of human trafficking. You know, you can call the hotline for information. You can call them to ask, where do I get posters that have the human trafficking hotline number on them? Or where's the closest anti-trafficking group that I could volunteer with? So that's not reflective of reporting cases of human trafficking. Of those 922 calls, there were 223 actual human trafficking cases that were confirmed. And that made North Carolina in the top 15 in terms of prevalence for human trafficking reports to the hotline. So I thought it might be interesting to look at sex trafficking and what venues sex trafficking is occurring in North Carolina. And as you can see, the top one is the illicit massage business. And so we'll look at an example of that in just a moment. And then tied for second is hotel and motel based and pornography. And just want to throw out that pornography is very closely related to sex trafficking, and that is something that our agency is very interested in, and we will be having a webinar about that shortly. So here is a case from Durham County where a massage parlor was committing human trafficking. Now, you will see here that they weren't actually charged with human trafficking. They pled guilty to 3 counts of promoting prostitution and received 3 years of probation. And the reason for that is that the victims in this case, and in most cases when it involves one of these massage parlors, the victims are from another country, typically China or another Asian country. They usually don't speak English. And so they are not really able to receive services and to receive the support that they would need in order to help develop a case and to help investigators. For that to happen, a person has to be fairly stable, you know, have a stable place to live and have an income. For them to get into an emotional and mental state that they could, you know, feel safe and want to help law enforcement put together a case. And we don't have services appropriate. You know, you can't develop that kind of rapport and trust and support through a language line. And we have very few service providers that have someone who can speak their language, even fewer that would be culturally competent. And aside from those issues, of course, you see the last line here, there's a tie to the Chinese mafia. So people are afraid, of course, to testify, and testifying is traumatic. So because of all of these reasons, often the folks, the perpetrators are allowed to plead guilty to lesser charges and receive fairly insignificant consequences. So most likely what happened here is this massage parlor closed down and the traffickers went across county lines or even across the state line and reopened another one. The victims in the case either went home or were reassigned to another massage parlor. So we mentioned that one of the other leading venues for sex trafficking to happen is in a hotel. And so I'll share this extremely tragic case from here in Pitt County. A couple of years ago, a 16-year-old died of an apparent overdose at a local hotel here. It was determined in the course of the investigation of her death that she was actually being trafficked, and that she had a 2-year-old child already. And so she had just turned 16 at her death. She'd only been 16 for a week or two. So what we know is, because she had a 2-year-old child, is that she had been being, at the very least, sexually abused from the time she was, around 13 or so. And sadly, that kind of tracks with what we know about sex trafficking, that it is much likely for someone who has been sexually abused as a child for that that abuse to continue, whether it's through continued sexual abuse, domestic violence in the future, or being trafficked. There's a greater chance of that person to continue that cycle of being victimized. So we're going to switch gears and look at labor trafficking here in North Carolina. And we'll see that the top two industries or types of work for labor trafficking are domestic work and agriculture. When we talk about domestic work, we're talking about, housekeepers, nannies, that kind of thing. And very often, the way they're recruited here, if they're coming from another country, which for that particular job they often are, they're told, this is going to be a great experience for you. You're going to work 40, 50 hours a week, taking care of the kids in the house, but you'll have evenings off, and you can take classes, or you can travel on the weekends, and it's going to be this great cultural experience. And then they get here and they're sleeping on the floor or in the basement, and they're not allowed to leave, and they're on call 24/7. And unfortunately, many times in these situations, not only are they being trafficked for their labor and taking care of the kids in the house, but they're also being sexually abused by the male members of the household. It comes as no surprise, I'm sure, that agriculture is one of the top venues for labor trafficking, given how much agriculture we have here in North Carolina. And the fact that so many of our farm workers are from out of the country and are extremely vulnerable to being trafficked. So here's an example of a case of labor trafficking that happened here in Eastern North Carolina. And these are some fairly common methods of abuse. So first of all, they were charged unlawful recruitment fees. It is illegal. Well, I should say, first of all, these particular workers were in the U.S. legally and lawfully under the H-2A guest worker program. And if a farm or farmer is a part of the H-2A program, they are not allowed to charge recruitment fees. Also, as a part of that, they are required to provide a contract in a language that the worker can understand, that lays out, what kind of crop they're going to be working in, how they're going to get paid. Is it by the hour, by the bucket, by the pound, and where they're going to be working. And so in this particular case, the workers did not get what was promised in their contract, and they were subjected to threats and were manipulated to keep working. Their passports were confiscated. And that's a really typical way of traffickers maintaining control over their victims. And they'll do it oftentimes in just such a personable way that you don't even realize it. So typically when the workers all arrive at the labor camp, they'll have a meeting, to kind of explain to them what the rules are and how things are going to work and that kind of thing. And so they'll say, oh, and while we're here, everybody, give me your passport so I can lock them up in the office and keep them safe for you. And they don't say we're going to lock them up so that you won't be able to leave here legally. What some of you may not be aware of is that under the H-2A guest worker program, the worker is tied to the employer, so that if the employer doesn't provide the housing they're supposed to, or doesn't provide enough work, or doesn't pay them, or requires them to work in a field they just sprayed pesticides in, the worker doesn't really have a recourse. Now, you're probably thinking, well, of course they do. They can call law enforcement. And I want you to think for a minute about who these workers typically are. Here in North Carolina, the majority of our H-2A workers are from Mexico. And you think for a minute what law enforcement is like there. And we know that folks from Mexico don't trust their own law enforcement. So they're in a foreign country where they don't speak the language. Is there any chance they're going to trust our law enforcement enough to call them? No. What they might decide to do is to leave, to escape this particular employment situation, so-called employment situation, and go down to the next farm over to work for someone that they hope will treat them better. Unfortunately, as soon as they leave this employer, then they are no longer, they've lost their legal status. They've gone off the grid. So the H-2A guest worker program is really, it almost seems like it was created to make the workers vulnerable. In this case, we have a somewhat happy ending. Legal Aid of North Carolina got involved and filed a civil suit and was able to get a settlement of $75,000, which sounds pretty good until you realize there were 13 workers for that to be divided among. But at least in this case, these workers did receive some reimbursement, so to speak, for the trauma that they had undergone. I want you to actually meet a former farm worker who went through this experience of being trafficked, and he's going to tell you his story.
Yo fui contratado por una persona en Florida, y así como yo viajé a Norte Carolina.
So these farm workers were in their community in Fort Pierce, Florida, as the Florida agricultural season was wrapping up, and they responded to an ad that they saw recruiting migrant farm workers for work in North Carolina. And when they called, they were put in touch with the Baltazar family. The Baltazar family promised these farm workers, including our two clients, that they would have immediate work, ample job hours offered in cucumbers and tobacco. They would be provided housing free of charge with a labor camp kitchen where they could prepare and cook their own meals, and that they would be providing transportation to the job from Fort Pierce, Florida to North Carolina free of charge. And it sounded like an attractive offer to our clients, and so they accepted.
Y todo venía pagado. Nosotros no tenemos que pagar nada. Sí. Cuando los fuimos contratados, dijeron que teníamos cocina, pero ya cuando estábamos en el campamento, dijeron que nadie podía meter en la cocina, nadie podía usar. Venimos al campamento y éramos 35 personas, y dijo que nadie tenía el derecho de salir, de irse, y que teníamos una deuda de $200 por persona de raíz de Florida a Norte Carolina, y tenía que pagar $9 de comida por cada tiempo de comida. Era un total de $18 diarios. de comida.
The meals that they were provided were not enough to sustain our clients, 2 adult men at that time. And so what they were doing also to supplement their meals was fishing in like a swamp that was behind the labor camp. And then they made a makeshift outdoor kitchen where they would cook this fish from the swamp nearby to supplement their meals. Their contractors, including Francisco Baltazar Jr., would be around the camp or in the fields, always armed. And he subjected them to armed bed checks when some workers tried to leave. The labor camp was set pretty far back from the public road. So you had to kind of drive through a little gate and then up a very long, sandy dirt path to get to the labor camp. And the worker barracks were in the back of the camp. And between the worker barracks and the road to get to the public road was where the traffickers, including Francisco Baltazar Jr., stayed. And so they stayed there so they could watch and make sure that the workers weren't trying to escape without paying this surprise transportation debt and their meal fees. So the workers that were housed in the camp were frustrated and concerned. They were now told that they could not leave without repaying a debt. They had, for this transportation fee, they had no way to repay the debt because there really wasn't that much work that was being provided to them. And they had mounting debt every day because they were locked out of the labor camp kitchen and had to pay their contractors for meals. And so you've got this pressure of this debt you now have to pay, and then mounting debt. You're thinking when the season really starts and there's a significant number of hours for me to work, all of my salary is then going to go to this debt, and I'm still going to be left with nothing. Some of the workers escaped, and there were several waves of workers escaping. And after workers escaped the first time, their contractors, including Francisco Baltazar Jr., rounded them up and, brandishing weapons and telling them that they were not allowed to leave without repaying their debts. And if they tried to leave, then they had bullets in their guns for them. Another group of workers left in the middle of the night, and I think they left in the middle of the night to prevent detection by the crew leaders, including Junior Baltazar. And when that happened, our clients, including Mr. Rivas, heard the gunshots and assumed that those workers were being shot at. And then Junior Baltazar entered their room, flipped the lights on in the middle of the night, holding a weapon, and had them counting off to see who was left in the camp. And this was very powerful and kept these workers, including our 2 clients, in that situation and made them think that they could not leave. They tricked them into sort of leaving the comfort of the community where they knew how to access things, and into taking this leap of faith and coming to work for them, in a different state, which happened to be North Carolina, to force them to work. We don't typically see force, fraud, and coercion in all of our trafficking cases, but this case certainly was an example where they employed all of those means to keep someone in the situation and with the intention of forcing them to work. We did ultimately, represented those workers to achieve a settlement with a migrant housing provider. And in that settlement, one of the provisions was that if they were going to be operating the camp for a certain period of time in the future, they had to install landline telephone in the worker barracks with a human trafficking poster that had information about human trafficking and the Polaris hotline number. Our clients had the benefit of working with some really amazing case managers. This was when we were just really at the cusp of forging relationships with professionals in other disciplines to serve human trafficking survivors. And so we were able to refer Mr. Rivas to a case manager in another state who helped him to stabilize. He's now been reunited with his family in a safe place, and has, through the help of the case manager and through his own power and drive, has been able to move on from this trafficking situation.
Que la gente es para trabajar, no es para que abusen de ellos, para que no lo traten mal, que la gente sea libre, que no sea esclavizada, porque nosotros emigrantes venimos a trabajar duro, pero no nos gusta que los traten mal. Eso nomás quiero decirle a las personas que contratan gente, que tengan un poco de compasión con nosotros.
So I'm going to pause for a moment and check to see if we had any questions. Not there. And thank you, Stephanie. It is powerful to hear a story from the person that it actually happened to. But thankfully, Mr. Rivas is happy and with his family, as Caitlin said. So this next case I wanted to share with you because it sort of set what we hope will become a precedent, sort of a landmark case in Durham County, where this perpetrator was convicted without victim testimony in court. Which is, as I'm sure you all know, highly unusual. So a recording of her talking about her experience was allowed to be used. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the issue of trauma, once someone's been through such a traumatic event as having been trafficked, it's incredibly difficult for them to even think about sitting in a courtroom full of people with the trafficker, the one who did all these horrible things, sitting right there in the front row, and sharing what happened to you. That's just another trauma. And so what we hope is that this will become more common, that the victims will not have to always testify in person. So getting back to a few of the numbers from the National Human Trafficking Hotline, you can see here that the vast majority of victims of human trafficking are female. And from the data that was collected, there are more foreign nationals than U.S. citizens or residents, although you can also tell from those numbers that didn't get reported. That piece of data wasn't collected, as much as, say, the gender was. So we might not want to put too much credence in that, but of the ones who reported, more were foreign nationals. So we're going to switch now and talk a little bit about the laws here in North Carolina that pertain to human trafficking and law enforcement, what charges how charges have looked over the last couple of years. So first of all, I thought we would go over just really briefly our current legislation, our current statutes here in North Carolina. The very first law mentioned here, all the way to the left, is actually the federal law. It's the only federal law we're going to mention, and it's the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which was passed in 2000. So this was the first law in the U.S. that defined human trafficking, that provided funding for services for victims and consequences for the perpetrators. And you'll see that it took North Carolina 9 years to pass a state law for human trafficking. And ours fairly closely mirrored the TVPA, the federal law. One problem with our state statute is that, like the federal statute, it said that anyone who's under 18 that is involved in commercial sex is automatically a victim of human trafficking, sex trafficking specifically. However, here in North Carolina, we had a prostitution statute that did not mention age. So if we had law enforcement who had not been trained in human trafficking and were not aware of this statute, and they encountered someone who was, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, who was involved, who had committed a commercial sex act, then they may arrest them because they weren't aware of the human trafficking statute that defined them as a victim. So it took us 4 years to correct that. In 2013, the Safe Harbor Law was passed, and the conflict between the statutes was erased. And it now in North Carolina, there's no statute under which you could arrest a minor for the crime of prostitution. Then in 2015, the General Assembly decided that sex trafficking awareness and prevention should be a part of the sex ed curriculum. We strongly support that. Unfortunately, there's no enforcement mechanism in that statute. So it's very much a hit or miss situation across the state. And I invite those of you participating today in the webinar to check with your local school or local school district to find out if sex trafficking has been included in the sex ed curriculum there. If it has not been, we would be glad to assist with that. You're welcome to contact me. In 2017, the General Assembly decided to require that a lot of different businesses and establishments post the human trafficking hotline. And again, we think that is a terrific idea, but unfortunately, again, there's no enforcement. So examples of the places where the hotline number is supposed to be posted. These include any place that has an ABC license. So we're talking about a lot of restaurants, and one would assume all bars, strip clubs, that kind of thing. Everything that's considered a, quote, transportation hub. So bus stations, train stations, airports, rest stops, all of those are supposed to have a hotline poster. Health clinics and emergency departments at hospitals. So I hope that you have seen some of these posters around, but I'm certain that you've been to some of these places and haven't seen them as well, again, because of the lack of enforcement mechanism written into the statute. In 2019, a couple of really positive things happened. As you can imagine, someone who is a victim of human trafficking probably has been arrested a lot of times for prostitution. They may very well have been arrested a lot of times for various drug charges. Many times the traffickers will force their victims to not only provide commercial sex acts, but sell or transport drugs, shoplift, commit larceny, even commit assaults. And so most trafficking victims have a pretty long criminal record. And so in order for them to move forward with their lives once they're out of the trafficking situation, it's really hard because they've got that criminal record that makes it difficult for them to get into school, to get good housing, to get a legitimate job. And so this statute makes it easier for trafficking victims to have charges in their criminal record expunged. And so that's a huge help. Now, it's still really difficult and complicated and still takes a lot of time, but it's easier than it was. So it's a positive. And the final statute that we'll talk about requires school personnel to receive training in child sex trafficking and child sexual abuse. Now, they only have to have 2 hours of training every other year, but that's a positive thing that they are receiving some training. So we are happy about that. A fairly new piece of news regarding law enforcement and human trafficking here in North Carolina. Some of you all may have seen this in the news last week. The U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District has announced a new human trafficking task force. And I believe that the idea is that they're going to start focusing in the Triangle area, because if you look at the list of law enforcement agencies that are on the task force, most of them are in the Triangle area, and hopefully we'll move east and assist with efforts further east as well. So our State Bureau of Investigation, of course, has a strong role to play in this issue of human trafficking. They have recently hired Assistant Special Agent in Charge, Casey Fillinger, to be the agent that is in charge of the human trafficking unit. And they are looking at hiring others. I think they have a couple more on staff currently and are looking to hire a couple more. They received a good amount of funding from the General Assembly to create a human trafficking team at the SBI, thank goodness. The agent informed me that they are proactively investigating networks here in North Carolina. They're also assisting local law enforcement. And many of you may be aware already, they have what's called original jurisdiction, which means they can investigate any human trafficking case in North Carolina. They don't have to be invited by the local law enforcement agency. So I mentioned when I was talking about the laws about our law enforcement not having been trained in human trafficking. So you see here that the first time that law enforcement was trained as a part of their basic law enforcement training in human trafficking was 2012. So that was 3 years after we had the statute. In 2016, there was human trafficking was required as a part of their continuing education that year. So we are hoping to get it required again soon, because it's been some time, as you can see. So another way that we can measure human trafficking, a type of human trafficking, is by the number of tips that are going into this cyber tip line. Now, this is specifically tips that are showing children being victimized online, right? And so, and these numbers are just for North Carolina. So they are from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, but this is just the North Carolina numbers. And look at the astronomical rate of increase in those cyber tips coming in. You'll see a huge difference between 2019 and 2020, and I'm sure we all know what happened then. So in March of 2020 is when the whole world shut down, and all the kids were at home and doing online schooling. And the predators knew that, of course, that the kids were spending even more time than usual online, and that they were at home. The parents were at home in many cases trying to work from home too. So they weren't being, in many cases, the kids weren't being strongly supervised on their computers. And so the level of predation increased significantly. Some of you may recall that we had 2 cases here in North Carolina of teenage girls who were lured out of their homes by two men. There were two separate cases, but they were lured out. Both of them were lured by men that had recruited and groomed them on the internet. Strangely enough, in both cases, the computers that the girls were using were computers that had been provided by the school. And thankfully, in both of these cases, the girls were recovered and the perpetrators were arrested. But those are just two examples that actually made the news that we know of, where kids were recruited and lured out by potential abusers. And then you see the numbers just continue to rise astronomically. So this is the number of tips coming in to North Carolina. This is the number of investigations that were started. And of course, you know, the tips have to go through a vetting process, and then investigations are started for the ones that are deemed to be worthy of investigation. And you can see that last year we had the highest number of investigations in the last several. And this is the number of actual arrests. Now, I don't have an explanation for why our investigations were so high and the arrest level was so low. And it could be that some of those investigations are still ongoing that were started in 2022. So this slide is showing county level information on the number of charges, of human trafficking charges. And so this includes sex trafficking and labor trafficking. You see Wake County has the top number of charges, Mecklenburg 14, Cumberland 9, and down from there. Now, if you're looking at this list and you're thinking, oh, my county's not up there, you know, we must not have human trafficking. No, that's not how it works. What this means is the counties that have the highest number of charges, that means they've got law enforcement that are working on this issue, and they're investigating human trafficking cases and making charges. So if your county is not up here, what I would suggest that means is you need to talk to your sheriff and to the police chiefs in your county and talk to them about devoting time to searching out human trafficking cases and investigating them. The other part of the slide shows the number of counties that had human trafficking charges. So you'll see the first year that we have 16, then it went to 19, 21, and then it dropped back down to 18 counties last fiscal year charged perpetrators with human trafficking. And so this shows the actual total number of charges for each year. Before we move on, I see that we do have a couple of questions. So Rachel's asking if hotels and motels were included in the statute that required them to have the human trafficking hotline posted, and I'm sad to report that no, they were not. That is something that we would like to see included. And Angela was asking, when I was speaking about the training for human trafficking training for law enforcement being included in the basic law enforcement training, was that everywhere or just Pitt Greenville? So that was statewide. The basic law enforcement training, that curriculum is the same across the state. Thank y'all both for that. Stephanie, if we're talking about for the cyber tip line, I do not have access to any further breakdown. Okay. Yeah. I am not aware of it. It might be possible that you could get that from the SBI's Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force, which is where I got this information from. All right. So something that has happened in Cumberland County in Fayetteville is they have started what's being referred to as a human trafficking court. What it really is people who have, primarily women, although not exclusively, who have been arrested for prostitution and other charges. If they are deemed to be likely to be a victim of human trafficking, then they are invited to what's being called Worth Court. And I'm going to have to be honest with y'all and tell you, I know that's an acronym, but I am sorry that I don't recall what Worth stands for. The idea is that you divert these folks into this Worth Court, into this program, and they receive services. They have case management. You can see here there are service providers that the case managers can refer the folks to. And it's intended to last for 12 to 18 months, basically, to help them rebuild their life, to help them forge a different path for themselves, so that hopefully they won't end up back in court. So currently, you saw on the previous slide, they've had 34 graduates, which I think is pretty amazing for 3 years. That's great. Currently, they've got 8 folks in the program. They are all survivors of sex trafficking. And just some demographic information here. All of them are at the federal poverty level. About a third finished high school. Most of them are adult, but they have served 5 juveniles. As I mentioned, the majority are females, but a significant male minority, 21%. And then the majority of folks in this program are white, with about a third being Black. So I'm going to, since we're moving out of talking about law enforcement and cases and that kind of stuff, I'm going to check Q&A real quick. Oh, thank you, Stephanie. She looked up Worth for me. We overcome recidivism through healing. Love that. Love that. Very powerful. So we've talked about laws and law enforcement. We haven't talked much about social services. So I want to talk about that a little bit. So I mentioned to you that in 2013 is when Safe Harbor got passed, and that anyone who was under 18 would be considered a victim of sex trafficking, if they were found in the commercial sex industry. They could not be arrested for prostitution. They were a victim of sex trafficking. Unfortunately, before they passed that law, no one talked to the Department of Social Services, Child Protective Services about that. And what happened is, in the statute, it specifically says, if law enforcement, if you come across anyone who's under 18 involved in the commercial sex industry, you call DSS. And DSS, takes custody of the child and determines next steps. Well, they had not talked to DSS about that. There was no procedure in place, no policies for how to handle this. And I am not being down on DSS. I mean, they had not been informed. And so it, as you can imagine, took them a little while to get their folks trained and get the correct forms in place and policies and that kind of thing. And so now they do have in their intake form, they've got very specific questions that ask, that obviously they're not asking the child these questions directly, but that the social worker who is filling out the intake ask about the possibility of sex or labor trafficking. So that's a real positive that now that's basically being screened for, being looked at by DSS. Here's an example of a training they did after that law got passed to help get the various DSS agencies on board, kind of up to speed. Now, this next section, I think is probably one of the most interesting to me. We have a lot of organizations across North Carolina that are working on the issue of human trafficking. And of course, there'd be no way for me to tell you about every single one of them. Although I am going to give you a resource where you can look up most of them yourself. So my goal in this next section is just to tell you about the ones that are doing statewide work. And if you have questions, again, I'll do my best to answer them. So the first one is the North Carolina Human Trafficking Commission. This commission was created by statute, and they are appointed by the governor, by the Speaker of the House, and the Senate Pro Tem. And so most of them are appointed by virtue of the position they have, the job they have. So for instance, the Secretary of the Department of Labor is a member of the commission. Now that person probably is invited to a lot of commissions. So he is actually not on the commission himself, but has a representative. And that's the case for several of them. You know, there's a representative from the Attorney General's office and from the Department of Public Safety and, you know, various others. And so here's just a list of some of the different things that they do. One of them that is particularly hard, but very valuable, is suggesting new policies, procedures, and legislation. And you'll also see on here developing regional response teams. And so that's something we'll look at in just a moment. The regional response teams are a concept that were actually developed by another group we'll look at in just a moment called the North Carolina Coalition Against Human Trafficking. But I assume the General Assembly wanted to be sure that a state agency had responsibility for oversight for that. And so they added that to the responsibilities for the commission. And pictured here with me is Jennifer Haywood, who is the current chair of the commission. So last year, the commission received a lot of money from the General Assembly to be, some of it to fund the commission's staff and the commission's work itself, $250,000 for that. And then 5 separate blocks of funds to issue grants to direct service providers. And they are continuing to work on that to put in place procedures for the grant applications and grant management. So I told you I was going to share with you a resource so that you could look up pretty much anybody doing the work, anti-trafficking work here in North Carolina. And this would be that resource. So you can take a screenshot if you want. But if you go to the commission's website, there's a link to this resource directory. Unfortunately, you'll see it's dated December 2020. So I hope that they plan to update it soon. But they're listed in there is every group that was doing anti-trafficking work that they could find in North Carolina. So it is pretty comprehensive. Of course, since then, some new ones have cropped up, and sadly, some have gone away, but some really good information there still. The other really, really helpful thing that the commission has done recently is to publish standards of care. And again, I invite you to take a screenshot, or again, you can go to their website for this. But what they've done is compiled in a fairly easy to understand, readable way, certain standards that are to be applied to service providers of human trafficking victims. So whether the service provider is, operating a shelter for victims, or has a drop-in center, or is doing case management, whatever that might be, they've got standards for it. And so the hope is that we as a movement will pay attention to the organizations that are adhering to these standards and support them with funding and with volunteerism and with referrals. And the ones that are not adhering to the standards, that they will hopefully decide to up their game and to begin to adhere, or that they would find another field. And the final thing that I'll mention about the Human Trafficking Commission, I mentioned the regional response teams. This is a little handout, actually. And again, if you want to do a screenshot, you can download this handout on their website. In fact, I can put that in the, oops. Well, I was going to try and put it in chat for you, but I think I'm going to leave it, and you can find it on their website. So like so many other groups that were working together, COVID hit the regional response teams hard. And several of them are sort of revamping and recreating themselves, and several new ones are trying to start. So if that is something that you are interested in, I encourage you to download this handout and to look at the bottom here for the other types of interdisciplinary teams. I mentioned one to you, that we have a Pitt County Coalition. We also have a Pitt County multidisciplinary team, and they have two very different functions. And if you're interested in starting either one of those, we would be glad to talk to you about that. So this is a fairly new organization in North Carolina, about 2 years old. And our nonprofit, NC Stop Human Trafficking, had the honor of partnering with Shield North Carolina and Legacy of Hope International. And the three of us all wanted to work on the issue of demand reduction. And for those of you who aren't familiar with demand reduction, basically what we're saying is that when you look at human trafficking, it's a business, right? People would not be trafficking, would not be in that business if they weren't making money. And so every business has supply and demand. In this analogy, the supply is our victims. It's people who are being bought and sold. And from the very beginning of the anti-human trafficking movement, which pretty much dates back to 2000 when the TVPA was passed, all of our resources and all of our efforts have been directed at supply. We've been looking at how to reduce vulnerabilities of potential victims. We've been looking at training professionals how to identify potential victims. And then we've been funding services for those victims to help restore them and help them move forward in a positive way in their lives. And all of that is crucial and is important and needs to be funded. Our position, though, is we've been leaving out half the equation, right? If you're only looking at supply and not looking at demand and not looking at reducing demand, then you're always going to have a supply. So what we're trying to do is to create and then execute a comprehensive plan to reduce the demand for services of exploited persons in North Carolina. Currently, most of our effort is being directed to demand reduction for the purchase of sex. We would, if this is something you're interested in, we would love to have you join us. Go to this website, ncdemandreduction.com. There's a list of different teams with what each team is working on, from legislation to law enforcement engagement to curricula, data collection, working with communication, the web page and the social media and that kind of thing. So just lots of different places that you could plug in if this is a topic you're interested in. So I strongly encourage you to participate. So this is another group you've already heard me mention, Legal Aid of North Carolina. And so they're a nonprofit law firm that provides legal services. And the two units that particularly serve human trafficking victims are the farm workers unit. They're the ones that filed the civil suit that got the $35,000 for the farm workers. And then there's also the Battered Immigrants Project. And so that department works with victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and sex trafficking. So if you are working with a victim or survivor who falls into one of those categories, and I should say the farm workers unit doesn't only help farm workers, although obviously the name implies that. They also work with other types of labor trafficking. So if you're working with someone who is having problems maybe with their immigration status or something like that, who is a human trafficking victim, then they can definitely help. They can help with things like getting a T visa, for instance, if the documentation can be collected. So I already mentioned this group, the North Carolina Coalition Against Human Trafficking. They're the ones who created the model for the rapid response teams years ago. They meet quarterly, and they are a network of experts. So they have folks from law enforcement to service providers to educators, just a wide variety of folks from different disciplines that come together to network and to train one another. And as I mentioned, we've been a part of this group since we started. So I recommend it. Shield, North Carolina is based in the Triangle, and they provide a lot of training based on, as our organization does, based on a person's profession and their services they offer, so that they know the signs to look for and how to best respond. And as I mentioned, of course, they're a partner with us in the North Carolina Demand Reduction Task Force. Many of you may be familiar with the North Carolina Coalition Against Sexual Assault. And actually, this organization was one of, if not the first, to begin to see sex trafficking cases and begin to want to to figure out, these cases are different from sexual assault. I mean, they are sexual assaults, but there's more to it than that. What do we do? How can we address this as a state? And so they were instrumental in starting the Coalition Against Human Trafficking and continue to be active in that. You'll see here, they do have a human trafficking program coordinator, Courtney Dunkerton, and she does a lot of trainings. And so I encourage you to go to their website or to reach out to her via email and get put on her email list so you know when she has trainings coming up. So other ways that you can get involved, of course, I already told you about our nonprofit at the very beginning. What I didn't mention then is that we are a membership organization and that you can join as an individual, or your nonprofit or your agency can be a member. Or if you are a business owner, or if you're an employee and think your employer might be interested, a business can also be a member. So I invite you to go to our website and take a look at our membership options, and we would love to welcome you to the movement. I would welcome you also to subscribe to our newsletter. We typically will choose a topic related to human trafficking and do a deep dive on it every week. It may be related to sex trafficking, labor trafficking. It may be related specifically to familial trafficking 1 week, or vulnerable populations like the Native American population or the LGBTQ population and how they're affected. And so we'll just pick a topic every week, do a deep dive. And then the other part of our newsletter that people I think find helpful is that we'll list trainings that are coming up. Our trainings, of course, but any other human trafficking trainings or conferences that we're aware of, we'll also add those so that you can become more educated from a variety of sources. We always encourage people to talk about human trafficking, and I think some people are uncomfortable with that. So if that's you, then you might want to follow us on our social media, and that would be a way that you could share posts. Might be a little less intrusive than actually talking to someone directly. And of course, currently we're in January, which is Human Trafficking Awareness Month. So it would be a great time for you to go to any of our social media accounts and share posts about Human Trafficking Awareness Month, about upcoming events, and about facts related to human trafficking. So I told you that we had a couple of upcoming webinars. I'm going to be doing this one on January 24th, Sex Trafficking, What's Porn Got to Do with It? And so it's all about the relationship of pornography to sex trafficking. And, from the fact that porn creates demand for sex trafficking, to the fact that people that are in the pornography industry are trafficked. So I do invite you to join me for that if that's something that you're interested in. And then the last one this month, tips for keeping kids safe online. And folks, after all those numbers I just gave you from the cyber tip line, if you've got kids or grandkids, I hope that you might think this would be an important one to watch. So my colleague Melinda will be leading that one. And finally, I'll just give you our contact information for myself, Melinda, and Vanessa, who is our newest team member who joined us in July. If any of us can help with any of your anti-trafficking efforts, I hope that you will shoot us an email, and we would love to engage with you. So I am going to check the Q&A again. If you've got questions or comments, please go ahead and throw them up there. There, I see someone's got a question about the North Carolina Demand Reduction website. If you scroll down, Tori, you will see a list of the different teams that we've created, and it'll have the email for the team facilitator, the team leader. And so you're welcome to just to contact them directly if you've got questions about their team, or if you think, I might be interested, I'm not sure, can I just go to the next meeting, kind of see what it's like? Because all the meetings, of course, are by Zoom. So, but yeah, just keep scrolling and you'll find the information that you need there. I was just looking back. We've got questions about the breakdown of the stats, and again, you'll have to contact the North Carolina Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force. I do not have any further breakdown, but they might be able to do that for you. I will send you a copy of the slides and a copy of this recording in case there's anyone that you want to share it with. And Angela, I am not sure if anyone has talked to Robeson County Lumberton Police or not, but shoot me an email and we'll talk about it. Y'all have been great. I appreciate you sticking with me. I hope to see you at the next webinar on sex trafficking and pornography. I'll hang out here for a couple more minutes in case anyone thinks of questions. But otherwise, we are all finished.